Welcome back to another lesson for New Testament Greek 1. This is lesson number 8, and it will correspond with chapter 12 in your textbook. In this lesson, I want to introduce the subject of the imperfect tense form of a verb in the active voice. In future lessons, we'll look at the imperfect tense form with middle and passive voice. And in addition, in this lesson, I would like to also cover broadly the subject of verbs in Greek and go into far greater depth than we have thus far in our previous lessons about the present tense form of verbs. And so you may want to look at this particular lesson as sort of the expanded subject of verbs in Greek and maybe watch it more than once so you become quite familiar with its contents. I wouldn't say you have to master this subject matter, as it will seem quite new and a little bit abstract in some ways, very different from English in terms of the emphasis in Greek on aspect versus time of action or kind of action. But just know that this is a lesson that you may want to go back and review until you become comfortable with its contents. And so with that, let's introduce our vocabulary list for this lesson. Before we look at our verbs, whether it's imperfect active indicative, the new form, or whether it's our overview of verbs today, let's just cover, to begin with, our vocabulary list for lesson 8, corresponding with chapter 12 in our textbook. It begins with the word Allah. Allah is a contrasting conjunction. It's normally translated but, and it is a stronger contrast than the conjunction de, delta epsilon. The next word is apokteno, meaning I kill, and this is a common word that occurs throughout the Gospels, especially because the spiritual leaders of Israel wanted to kill Jesus, and so you see this term pop up frequently there. The next word is a geographical term. It's for Galilee, and of course you can see that. It's just transliterated practically, and it's in the feminine, Hey Galileia. And much of Jesus' ministry transpires up in Galilee, so in the Gospels you see Galilee used quite frequently. The next word is the word for earth or land. Sometimes it can be translated. It's the word gay, and it's feminine, so the article is he. And you might recognize the English word geo from this, whether it's geography or geology or geopolitics or something along those lines. That's where we get the English word from this Greek word. The next word is eti. It's an adverb meaning still or yet. And the next two words are verbs. Hetoimazo, meaning I prepare. And then the next word is therapeuo, which you will recognize our English word therapy is where we get for that word. And therapeuo means I heal. And this is a common word in the Gospels as Jesus went about healing in all of Israel. Now we see on this list several names, starting with the name of Jesus. And you'll notice the article before his name, ha, and that's very common that you see in the New Testament and in Koine Greek, that the definite article is used before a proper personal name, unlike English. And that takes some getting used to, but just understand that sometimes it appears, sometimes it doesn't. And it seems to be almost like an idiom of Koine Greek. So this would be pronounced ha Iesus, and the next word down is ha Israel, of course for Israel. And the word after that is the word for John, ha Ioannes. And if you notice carefully, if you drop off the ending, the nes ending, you have in essence Ion. Ion is how it would be pronounced. And in Scottish, the word for John is Ian, and you can see where that name comes from. The next word down is a verb, kradzo, and it means to cry out. And of course, John the Baptist would cry out as he preached, and others would as well. And Jesus did at times. So this is a verb that's common in the Gospels as well as Acts. The next word down is an adverb, especially important when it comes to time and references for kind of action in verbs. It's the adverb noon, which is the word for now. The next word is uketi, which means no longer. Again, another adverb, again underscoring time or transitions in narratives. The word after that is a noun that means darkness or the darkness, he skatia. And then we have another adverb. This time it's the word tate, and this is an important word, and again marking a transition in a narrative or time, and so be aware of tate. And then there's the verb huparko, which means I am or I exist. And then the last word on our list is hos, which means as, while, when, a very common word that you should know. Now, to this point in our study of Greek verbs, we have simply studied the present tense and three voices that go with it in the indicative mood, and of course, all the persons and number that go with that. But in this lesson today, what I would like to cover with you is a new form, the imperfect, as well as the active voice, and again, just for the indicative mood, corresponding with all these persons and number. And before we even get to that portion, though, in our study, I think it's important that we spend quite a bit of time reviewing the Greek verb system. I touched on this in lesson 2 and gave you a little bit of an overview then, but I want to expand on that considerably in this lesson now today. And let's just stop and consider for a moment English as we compare it with Greek. English is what I would call a tense prominent language in the sense that it emphasizes the time of an action. And let's just use the example of the simple phrase, I study Greek. This is obviously present tense in English, but concerning the time of action, when exactly do I study Greek? It's not really specified. In fact, you would need more context to determine the answer to that question. It could be you could study Greek at this very moment that you're speaking and making this statement, or it could be a more generalized time concept when you say, I study Greek. You could be referring to the fact that you're a Greek student right now in Gibbs. So within a matter of a few days you've been studying this, or maybe tomorrow you're planning to study this, or next week. And so it could be a broader perspective in the sense of being still present in time, but not very specific. In English, we could clarify both the time of the action and the kind of the action by adding a simple statement to it, such as, I am studying Greek. And this form of that construction for the present tense is what we would call the progressive present tense in English. Here, time of action is at the very moment of this person speaking, and it seems to be a continuous ongoing action as well. So both time and kind of action are indicated by this form of the expression. And in English, we could note that something is a progressive tense, not only with the present tense, but also with the past tense and the future tense, as you can see from our illustration here. Just by simply saying she walks, present tense, or she is walking, gives it a little more of a progressive feel that it's presently undergoing or ongoing. You could now go back in time with the past tense and say she walked, but you add also the linking verb she was walking and add the ing ending to it, and it gives it a little more of a progressive feel. If we wanted to zoom out a little bit and say that we're not looking at something ongoing per se in past time, we could say she had walked, and that definitely indicates that her walking was concluded from the standpoint of the speaker. Now, to make it a little more of a transitional form of expression from past into present, that she did walk in the past, she is still walking today, you could say she has walked. And of course, we could cast this all forward in future time, and that progressive way of expressing a simple future statement pertains to the future as well. So English has a way of noting a simple time of action as well as kind of action by the way in which it adds endings as well as supplies additional linking verbs or helping verbs. And you can see from our 2D graph here, two-dimensional graph, that English emphasizes primarily time of action and then secondarily kind of action. by its verb tenses. In English, this is essentially a 2D system, though it's also true that there is some element of a third aspect that we'll see that is more prominent with Greek, and that is aspect, in addition to time and kind of action, a 3D perspective. With English, that's more in the background and it's more subtle. With Greek, it is actually something that is very prominent, this idea of aspect. And we'll get to that in just a moment as we go on. But I do want to mention that in Koine Greek studies, this is very important for your understanding, and it will also help explain why our textbook is not all that clear and in fact inaccurate on some things. But you should know this, that in Koine Greek studies, even New Testament studies using the Koine language of the period of the New Testament, it was only up until about 30 years ago that it was assumed by Greek scholars, some of the best scholars, that Greek in essence had a 2D system. The time of action and kind of action were the two things being emphasized. It was thought that Greek verbs were like English in the sense that Greek verbs emphasize primarily these two things, time and kind of action, by their conjugations or their tense forms that we've been learning on our paradigms and such. But we're going to see in a moment why that understanding is actually incorrect. First, let's consider time in Koine Greek. In Greek, the present tense form, and by the way, when I say tense form, I'm referring to luo, for example, meaning present active indicative, as opposed to luamai, meaning present middle or passive indicative. So when I refer to the tense, I'm referring to the tense form in particular, the way in which it's spelled. So in Greek, the present tense form is used for actions not only in present time, but also in past time, in past up to present time, and also of future time. Here we have an example of present tense form for blepo and lego. In this case, it's the present tense form, but it's being used for past time. This is an example in John 1:29 of what we would technically call the historical present. Very common in narrative portions of the New Testament, the Gospels and Acts and such, where you can see that the writer here, John, wanting to add vividness to the scene in which you are reading, uses the present tense rather than a past tense, and says the next day John saw, literally sees, Jesus coming toward him and says, literally, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. But of course, the translators here have put it in the past tense, even though it's present tense in form, because they recognize that sometimes the present tense form is used for a past tense or past time scene or act or event, like we have here. And of course, good writers today are taught to describe things most vividly, most commonly using the present tense form. And here we have in 1 John 3, verse 8, the use of the present tense form for I sin, hamartano, but it's used to show not merely present time, but past time, in fact, past action extending to the present. Here we have hamartano used, you'll see the highlighted yellow word there, hamartane, and this is the third person singular present active indicative form of hamartano. But we would not translate this this way, for the devil sins from the beginning. That would put it purely in its present time as perspective, but it's not. It's really past time, or past time extending to the present, to be precise. It's present tense in form, but it's translated in the past tense here, has sinned. Why is it? Why? It's not a past tense verb per se. Well, again, keep in mind that in Greek, verbs primarily do not indicate time of action. They primarily indicate what's called aspect, as I'll touch on going forward here. But I think the reason why it's translated in this verse in the past tense is because the prepositional phrase from the beginning governs the time in which we should understand the action, that the action was such that it occurred in the past and it extended from the past to the present. So the devil has sinned from the beginning. In other words, he started to sin in the beginning, and he sins even now. It's sort of like in that illustration that I used earlier of the woman walking. She walks, past tense, she walked. But if you want to have extending from past to present, you would say she has walked. And that gives the impression to the English reader or listener that she did walk in the past, but she may still be walking now. That's kind of the same idea here in 1 John 3:8. And so what I want to show you with this example is that context really defines or determines the time of the verb's action, not so much the tense form in which it appears. And so based on examples like these, don't assume in your exegesis of Scripture that just because a verb is in the present tense form, it must be referring to action that is always happening in present time. That is not true, and you have to be careful and be aware of the context in which those verbs are being used. Now, what we have here in John 14, verse 3 is an example of the present tense form being used for future time. Jesus' promise to the disciples in the upper room where he says, I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again. And the form of the word erchomai, as we learned last time, is actually present tense, indicative mood. It's not future tense, but here it's translated as future because Greek grammarians understand that the present tense form can be used for past action, could be used for present action, could be used for future action, as it is here. In fact, the present indicative form of verbs in the New Testament are used in context of actual present time, present action, only about 70% of the time. So you might think that present tense always means present ongoing action. That is not necessarily true. In fact, 30% of the time, it's either past or it's future. So you have to be very careful with this. And part of it is just understanding the lingo that when we refer to something as a present tense, when we do our parsing and our analyzing of verbs, what we really mean by that is it's in a present tense form. That's just the label that we stick on it. But that present tense form, of course, has a broad variety of usages. Now, when it comes to the aorist tense, as we'll learn in Greek Grammar 2, Semester 2, it also can be used in context of past time most of the time, especially when it's with the indicative mood. About 85% of the time, the aorist indicative is used for past tense in its context. But what that means is it leaves about 15% of the time where the aorist indicative is either used in a present time context or a future time context. So again, you have to be aware of the context in your surroundings. You cannot make just general assumptions and draw a simple one-to-one comparison that because it's present tense form, it's present time in action. In fact, we're going to see in this lesson, as we look at the imperfect tense form in a minute, that you can't always assume that it means ongoing continuous action in past time. You will get in big trouble if we do that. That's why we're going to look at in this lesson several examples of exceptions to that norm for the imperfect tense indicative mood form. But that raises a question at this point. If a verb's conjugated form, or what we usually call its tense form, doesn't necessarily denote the time of the verb's action, then how do we determine when the action of the verb actually occurs? Well, this way, as you see on the slide here, that the time of an action, whether past, present, or future in Greek, is not inherent to the verb's tense form. So what you need to do is look for other words in the context, such as adjectives, adverbs of time especially, and even prepositional statements like we saw in 1 John 3:8, from the beginning that the devil sins. Now, some of these words, here are some examples that are very common in the English anyway. You're going to see quickly, immediately, then, now. We saw some of these with noon and tate in our vocabulary list for this lesson. Still, from, until, after, already, before, as, again, etc. And there's far more than just these. And just as time of action is not necessarily encoded in a verb's tense form, neither is the kind of action, what we call Actionsart in English from the German word for the kind or sort of action. Aktionsart is how they say it. And you can see where we get the understanding for kind or sort of action from that German word. So when you're seeking to determine the kind of action, whether it's a momentary, instantaneous type of action, whether it's iterative or repetitive, or whether it's ongoing, continuous, etc., in Greek, that is not indicated by the verb's tense form. So you need to do two things. You again need to look at context. Look at those adjectives, adverbs of time, prepositions again. But secondly, look at what's called lexis. That's not a type of car. That is actually the nature of a verb itself by its inherent meaning. Some verbs are, by their very nature, they lend themselves more to instantaneous or continual type of action. Just take the verbs themselves, die. Well, when you say someone's going to die, you don't mean a 30-year process. You're referring to something that's more instantaneous. Same with the word dip or hit or fall, etc. And then there are some verbs that, of course, by their very meaning, imply something that is ongoing, like the word continue or persevere or endure or something like that. So don't assume that, again, just because something is a present tense verb, it means action in present time that is continuous or ongoing. And don't assume when it comes to aorist tense verbs that this refers to action that occurs only once in past time. Both of those are myths and misunderstandings that we need to be well aware of as we go on with Greek. Now I want to introduce here a new term that you need to know and understand well. It's the word aspect. Now, in contrast with Greek, again, English emphasizes time of action, and thus we call that tense. That's our understanding and the meaning of the word tense. We think past, present, future. And again, that's confused oftentimes with tense form as we're looking at Greek. But what Greek emphasizes by its tense forms, labeled present, future, aorist, etc., what it emphasizes is not time of action, but the perspective of the speaker or the writer. We call this aspect. When you hear the word aspect, think of a photographer and the word aperture. What does a good photographer do? He doesn't just use one lens or one setting, focal setting on his camera. He uses a variety of them to capture different perspectives on the action that's occurring. The same is true with Greek writers and speakers. That's exactly what they did. They would use these different tense forms to vary the aperture, so to speak, or lens through which they were viewing or portraying a particular action. That's what we call aspect. And some languages are aspect prominent, like Greek, like some of the Slavic languages today. But in our understanding of Western language, such as English or French or German, these are more tense prominent languages, and so it's a little more foreign to our understanding. But I want you to know there are languages out there that are more aspect dominant rather than tense prominent. And so to this point, we've seen that many languages are really 2D, two-dimensional, when it comes to verbs. Namely, they have time and kind of action or actionsart. But there's also a third axis or dimension to Greek verbs, and that's this issue of aspect. Kind, time, and aspect are three different factors you need to distinguish when you look at Greek verbs. In fact, in the future now, what I want you to do, though it's not in your workbooks, is I want you, when you parse a word, they don't ask for this in your exercises, in your workbook. They'll ask you the time of the action, or at least the tense form, but you should be in your mind anyway, making a mental note of these three things: time of the action, what kind of action is involved, and what is the aspect or perspective in which this action is being viewed. Now, these three categories are so often mixed together or confused, and they're so foreign to how we think as English speakers, our native tongue being English, as we think of verbs, that It may be very difficult for you at first to resist the temptation to view Greek verbs through the lens of English and English verb usage, but you must resist that. I'm telling you, you need to literally retrain your brain to view verbs from the perspective of the Greek language, which inherently denotes aspect rather than time of action or kind of action. So you need to think now primarily in terms of aspect. And again, what is the aspect? It's the writer or speaker's perspective of the action, whether it's imperfective or perfective, and I'll clarify that in a moment, as well as either proximate or more remote. And these things have to be distinguished. Now, I do want to say this just on a personal note, that it may seem initially much easier for you to take a shortcut with your Greek studies and say, well, it's hard enough for me, Tom, to simply memorize these forms in which these verbs occur, that the present active indicative luo has to be distinguished from the present middle passive form lu amai, let's say. And so it's hard enough for me to make those distinctions. Now you want me to think in terms of 3D? But I'm telling you this, that if you simply draw a one-to-one correspondence and say, well, present active indicative must mean this, because it's in the present active indicative tense form, therefore, all it means is ongoing action in present time. You're going to get in a lot of trouble as an exegete of God's word if that's the understanding you proceed with. It may seem like a shortcut now, but you're going to run into verses in the New Testament where that definition, that simplistic view, just doesn't fit the verse that you're studying. And so the present tense form, as we've seen already, and this may be used for present time, it may be used for past time, may be used for future time. It may also be used for ongoing action, that's true, or it could refer to momentary instantaneous action. And so it all depends on the context again, not the particular tense form. Let's be very clear about that. So neither time nor kind of action are inherent in the Greek verb's tense form, like luo, or as we'll learn today with the imperfect form, eluon, but only aspect is what's inherent in the verb form itself. And I'm going to introduce a couple more terms to you today, not to confuse you, but just throw them out there, because these are terms that are used by Greek grammarians, commentators, and such, and you may hear them. There's something called the semantic value of the verb. The semantic value of a verb has come to mean in Greek studies the inherent aspect of a verb's action that's encoded into the particular tense form in which that verb appears. Now, another term besides semantic value is what's called pragmatic meaning, or pragmatics in Greek studies. And this refers to the time and kind of the verb's action, not determined by its tense form or spelling or conjugation, but determined by context and lexis, its affected meaning, in other words. Now, I don't expect you to remember these two terms, semantic and pragmatic, but just be aware that there is this distinction that's out there. Now, with abstract concepts such as 3D, thinking of verbs in Greek, it can be very helpful to just have a few key illustrations to help clarify these things in our mind that we can go back to and refer to cement these things. And so I want to reintroduce for you this parade analogy to distinguish two types of perspective of action, or two types of aspect. You won't find this in your textbook by Ray Summers, but this is how you need to understand Greek verbs going forward. There are two types of, two categories of aspect that I want you to learn about Greek verbs at this point. There's debate about a third category called stative, but at this point I want you to learn imperfective versus perfective aspect. Two essential different views of an action. Imperfective aspect refers to time of action that is viewed as being in progress, that is closer in proximity, like the families that are sitting on the curb watching these Shriners go by on their little scooters. They're right on the curbside, the action's right in front of them, it's ongoing, in the sense that it's in progress right in front of them. And then, in essence, you would zoom out and have an aerial, more bird's eye view of the same parade, perhaps, where you could see the beginning of the parade farther down the street, and you could see the end of the parade right in front of you as well. This is what's called perfective aspect, that views the action as a whole in its entirety, in complete or summary fashion from a more remote perspective. And here again is a comparison between the two different aspects, perfective or imperfective. One is viewing the action more externally, the other is viewing it more internally, up close, or closer, I should say. And what you need to keep in mind with perfective aspect is that this again is called external viewpoint by some. And with a verb that has perfective aspect, the writer or speaker chooses to portray the action with a sense of completeness from the outside, without reference to or an emphasis on its development. It's a summary or all-encompassing vantage point for the verbal action, in which both the beginning and the end are normally in view. Think of the beginning of the parade and the end point of the parade on that street. Now, in contrast to the perfective aspect or vantage point, we have the imperfective aspect. This is sometimes called the internal viewpoint. With an imperfective verb that has that aspect, imperfective aspect, the speaker or writer chooses to portray the verbal action with a sense of incompleteness from the inside of the action, as if it were developing right in front of him. So the imperfective aspect emphasizes the unfolding of the verbal action as that person or reader, as if they were there in some sense watching it take place right in front of them. Now obviously the action had to have started at some point in the past, but the author or speaker isn't necessarily viewing the starting line or the finish line. They just see the action unfolding right in front of them. And so in that sense it's called imperfective aspect. Now, many Greek scholars think that there is a third aspect in Greek called stative that essentially combines perfective and imperfective aspect, but I'm only going to mention it at this point because it's beyond our scope of study in Greek Grammar 1. We'll revisit this concept of stative in the perfect tense and pluperfect tense forms in second semester Greek, but I'm just going to mention it at this point. You don't have to know about it yet. But just be aware that there's some people who think that there's a third category of aspect called stative. At this point, I want you to learn imperfective and perfective and have that distinction down clearly in your thinking. Now, because analogies and illustrations help us visualize abstract concepts, let's revisit the parade analogy again, this time using a little different graphic here. Imagine a verb in Greek, and the verb would be translated into English with three words: conduct a parade. Imagine if there were such a Greek verb. There was one word in Greek translated with those three English words. That action could be portrayed in one of two ways or from two vantage points, either from the external viewpoint where you're up above or you're viewing it more remotely, you're more removed from the scene, and again, you can see the whole collective action from beginning to end. Or it could be viewed internally, where the action's just unfolding right in front of you. So there's the parade analogy. Or to use a similar but different illustration, let's think of a skyscraper. Imagine there were a Greek verb that meant build a skyscraper. Well, there's two ways that action could be portrayed by the speaker or the writer of Scripture. He could say, he could look at that action from the vantage point of zooming out and looking at it more from afar with remoteness, and he would view the skyscraper as complete from beginning to end, or in this case, from bottom to top. Or he could look at it as presently under construction, zooming into a part of the action, a small piece of the skyscraper, and see action ongoing, perhaps inside the skyscraper. And here we have one more illustration. In this case, the example of a verb that would mean to write a book. And you could look at that from two different vantage points again. from the aspect of external viewpoint, or perfective aspect we would call it, on the left, where you see the completed manuscript having already been all typed out. Now it's on the publisher's desk, just waiting for them to put it in book form and publish it. Or it could be viewed internally, where the writer is still in process of writing right in front of you. That's called internal viewpoint or imperfective aspect. And I should clarify again with each of these examples, and we're going to see this with more New Testament examples, that just because an action was perfective in aspect, that's how it was viewed or portrayed by the writer or speaker, that action could be ongoing in its past. When that manuscript was being composed, there obviously was an ongoing act of typing involved. And so keep in mind that aspect is something different from the kind of action or the time of the action. And you'll see what I mean more about that as we proceed with some New Testament examples and further clarification. Now let's use another illustration as well as another clarification and question about which tense forms actually correspond with the imperfective aspect versus perfective aspect. You can see on the illustration here I've put present and imperfect tense forms are used to convey an imperfective aspect of an action, whereas aorist and future tense forms are used for perfective aspect. There's also some debate about the perfect tense forms, pluperfect tense forms. I'm not going to touch on those until second semester Greek. But for now, understand that the present and imperfect tense forms are used for this imperfective aspect that views an action as in progress. The present and imperfect tense forms don't tell us whether the action is being done one time, whether it's repeated at intervals, or it's something that's continuous. What the present and imperfect tense forms denote is simply an act that's portrayed as being in progress at the moment it is being viewed. And this is why I used the reel-to-reel type camera here to best illustrate this imperfective aspect, in contrast to what's called the perfective aspect, which I think takes a snapshot of the action, and thus the old Polaroid instant camera is a good illustration of that. With the imperfective aspect, the aorist and future tense forms are used to view an action or event from the standpoint of the writer or speaker in its entirety, as a complete whole, with its beginning and ending in view, thus in summary fashion. And so the perfective viewpoint of the action is kind of like taking one snapshot of the whole action. Now, up to this point, I've used some illustrations to clarify these concepts of time versus kind versus aspect. But what I'd like to do now is begin to incorporate some verses from the New Testament that will clarify these distinctions I've been talking about. And here we have in Mark 14, verse 20, a reference to the Last Supper with the Lord Jesus. And of course, it was Judas who was going to betray him. And Jesus said, "You'll know which one I'm referring to as the betrayer. It is one of the 12 who dips with me in the dish." What's interesting about this example is that the verb that's used there for dips, it's a form of the word for baptize, embaptomenos. It's a participle form. And here it's past in time because it's in reference to the Lord's Supper, of course. We know from the narrative that that is its time in which it's occurring. But what is the kind of action involved? It involves something that is instantaneous rather than something that is ongoing. There are those who are Lordship salvationists who say in order to be truly saved, you must believe, and if you have real saving faith, that faith will continue and be fruitful. And they often appeal to the present tense and say, well, because this verb believe is in the present tense, pisteuo, it must therefore mean that you have to have an ongoing faith in order to be truly saved. And that's just simply a flat-out misunderstanding or wrong assumption about Greek tenses. Just because a verb is present tense in form doesn't mean that it is ongoing in terms of its action start or the kind of action that it is. It may in fact be something that is instantaneous, like we see here. Judas was not continually dipping and dipping and dipping and dipping for the rest of his so-called Christian life. Hardly. This was a one-time act because it was the Last Supper and the cup was being passed around and such. But what is the aspect of this action? It's viewed imperfectively and proximate. The writer is in the scene, and Judas is dipping right in front of him, and that's how it's portrayed. Even though it's a present tense form of the participle here, it's imperfective in terms of its aspect, but it's instantaneous in terms of its action start. Another erroneous assumption about Greek verbs is that the aorist tense form necessarily refers to action in the past that is instantaneous or once for all and not continuous. But consider Romans 5 verse 14 for a moment. Here we have in the statement, nevertheless death reigned from Adam to Moses. The verb for reigned, basiluo, is its present tense active voice form. And here we have the aorist tense form used. And so what is the aspect? What is the action start, the kind of action, and what is the time of this action? Well, here you have a past tense time reference, and it's not because it's simply in the aorist indicative, but also because the context confirms that for us with the statement, the prepositional phrase, from Adam to Moses. So therefore we know it's referring to action in the past. But what kind of action was it? Was it once for all action? Did one person die and it's viewed remotely? Nope. This was an iterative or continuous, repetitive type of action, as one person died after another, all the way from Adam up to the time of Moses before the law ever came. And so its action start was something that was repeated. It wasn't instantaneous or momentary, and yet its aspect is viewed remotely or as perfective. The writer Paul is looking back in time on what transpired in that era from Adam to Moses. In Revelation 20, verse 4, we have a similar example where the aorist is used for a continuous future action that's viewed remotely or perfectively as something that's complete. Revelation 20, verse 4, it describes the millennial period of 1,000 years, and it says, and they, that is the saints who are resurrected, they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, John obviously is writing from a vantage point in the present age, looking forward in future time to the millennial or kingdom age. And so the time of the action of the verb for live as well as for reign, the time of that action is obviously future from the standpoint of John, the writer. But what kind of action is it? Well, it's just like Romans 5:14. It's iterative or continuous. It's not something that's once for all. And in terms of its aspect, how it's viewed or portrayed by John, he views it from a perfective or remote aspect from afar. To this point in our Greek studies, we've learned about the present tense, and today we're going to learn about the imperfect tense form. And that leads to an important question about these two tense forms. If both the present tense form and imperfect tense forms that we're about to learn, if they both have imperfective aspect that views an action internally, then how do they differ from one another? That's a very important distinction. Well, both the imperfect tense and the present tense are considered imperfective in aspect in the sense that they view the action as being in progress. Remember, simply by saying that it is in progress doesn't necessarily mean that the action is continuous over a longer period of time. It may be in progress only for a very brief period of time, maybe even instantaneously, but it is still viewed as occurring at that moment. Now, when it comes to proximity versus remoteness, this is another distinction between the present tense form and the imperfect tense form. Though they're both imperfective in aspect, One is a little more proximate and the other is a little more remote. The present tense form is more proximate. That's the curbside view, whereas the imperfective tense is a little more remote from that. Think of it as viewing the parade from about a block away. It's not as remote, for example, as the aorist tense or future tense, which would have more of that bird's eye aerial view of the parade. To help clarify these distinctions again between time of action, kind of action, and aspect of the action, here's an interesting example from Mark chapter 12. This is the account of the widow's mite, of the poor woman who put in out of her necessity, in contrast to the others who put in out of their abundance. And what's interesting to note in this passage is that you've got the same verb that's used throughout, the word balo, which you've already learned. It means to cast or throw. In this case, it means to put into a treasury. And notice how it's used. It's used in the present tense form, in the light blue there. It's also used in the imperfect tense form for the red there in verse 41. And the remaining yellow instances are all aorist tense forms. Now, if it were the case that the tense form indicated a specific kind of action, action sort, that the present tense would mean continuously putting in every time it's used, or that the aorist tense meant one-time action, then you would have a contradiction within the gospel here of Mark. You would have a contradiction between verse 41, which portrays the people generally putting in money present tense into the treasury, and then verse 44, the people generally, for they all put aorist tense out of their abundance. You would have a contradiction in terms of how Mark is describing the same action. But there is no contradiction in the Word of God. The contradiction has been in a wrong traditional misunderstanding of Greek tenses and what they imply. Mark here is portraying the action differently in verse 44 than he does in verse 41. And he also portrays it differently with the imperfect that's used in verse 41 for the rich as well. Within this scene, the present tense is used for a closer, proximate view of the action that's in progress as Jesus is sitting and watching this unfold, and how Mark is describing Jesus watching this. And then the imperfect tense is used to zoom out a little bit and view one segment of that populace that was putting money into the treasury, namely the rich. And the reason that the imperfect is used in verse 41 of the rich is because it's going to be used in contrast to the widow who was poor, the rich versus the poor in this case. And so that's why the writer here, Mark, zooms out a little bit to provide a contrasting background for us as we read. And then the aorist tense is used most frequently here because the action is being viewed now even more remotely. He's zooming out even further as he concludes his point about this entire action or episode that was unfolding there at the temple. So the action is viewed in its entirety or in more of summary fashion. To this point in this lesson, we've considered the distinction with Greek verbs between aspect, which is the subjective portrayal of an action or perspective by the writer or speaker, versus the kind of action. It may be instantaneous, it may be ongoing, and versus the time of action of the Greek verb, past, present, or future. We've also considered two types of aspect, perfective versus imperfective aspect. Now let's focus on a new tense form that you haven't learned yet up to this point, though I've mentioned it. It's the imperfect tense form. In this lesson, it's just going to be about, from here on out, it's just going to be about the imperfect tense form with the active voice. We're not going to cover middle and passive voice. We'll get to that in a future lesson. But I do want to clarify something here about our textbook by Ray Summers. He actually gets something wrong in his chapter on the imperfect tense, and I don't fault him for that. That was the common understanding at the time that he originally wrote. I believe it was 1950 when this book was first published. And even at the time in which it was revised in 1995 when it was published, the form of the book we're using, it was only about 1990 when some serious breakthroughs were occurring in our understanding of verbal aspect in Greek. And so it took some time for that clarification to filter down into introductory textbooks. And so even popular textbooks today, like the textbook by Zondervan with Bill Mount's Introductory Greek, even he is fuzzy on some of these concepts and distinctions. But here we have a statement in our textbook by Summers where he says the imperfect may be translated in different ways, but it always represents continuous or continual action in the past. I want to show you through several examples why that statement is not accurate, and you probably want to put a note in your textbooks to that effect as well. Now here are some basic points you should know about the imperfect tense form. It's called imperfect not because there's something about it in terms of its quality that's less than perfect, but it's only imperfect in terms of its aspect. And so keep that in mind. There's nothing faulty per se about this tense form. Secondly, it's most often used in past tense contexts. Even though Summers says that it's always past tense, that's not true, as we'll see in several New Testament examples I'll show you. It's true that probably 95% maybe even a little higher of the times in which the imperfect tense occurs, it's going to occur in the past tense context, but it's context that determines that, not the particular tense form. Thirdly, the imperfect tense may be used again for past action, it may be used for present action, or what's called unrestricted time. In my study of the New Testament, I have never seen, and I've never seen anyone else present an example of the imperfect tense being used in a future context. So interestingly, it's never used in the future, to my knowledge, though it can be used for past, present, or unrestricted, kind of open-ended time, if you will. And then another thing to note is that it's often used, I would say maybe even most often used for continuous action, but not always. And you have to be clear that it doesn't inherently mean continuous action in past time, as Summers puts it. It may be used for continuous or momentary action. And we're going to look at several examples where it does occur as momentary or instantaneous action. Here's a statement from a more up-to-date textbook that is introductory regarding Koine Greek and reading it. It's by Rodney Decker, and he describes the function of the imperfect tense form this way. He says the substantive difference between the present, i.e. present tense form, and imperfect tense forms is remoteness. The imperfect is used in statements that are more remote than statements using the present. The imperfect may be logically, temporally, physically, or focally remote compared to the present tense form. The imperfect often has a discourse function in narrative. It supplies background information or sometimes introduces dialogue or summary statements. Now, we saw that that was actually true in the case of Mark chapter 12. Let's go back there. In Mark 12 again, we saw that the same people group in verse 41, the people broadly were putting money into the treasury, and there the present tense form of bala was used, whereas down in verse 44, the same group of people broadly, collectively the people, put money into the treasury, and there the aorist tense form is used. And two different aspects are what's being used there. Well, what about the imperfect tense in verse 41 that's highlighted in red, where the rich people put in money? Well, the function of the imperfect there is that it seems to be noting a contrast, providing some background information that will allow for this contrast with the poor widow who put in her mites. And so it serves a narrative function in that regard and allows different angles and perspectives again on the same type of action occurring in a scene. Here is an illustration of the three tense forms that we're going to be covering in first semester Greek. The present tense form, imperfect, and in a future lesson we'll get to the future tense form. And just disregard for the moment the aorist, perfect, and pluperfect forms. We'll get to those in second semester Greek. But it might be helpful just to view these three that we're going to study in this semester side by side for comparison's sake. First of all, with the present tense form, the aspect is imperfective in the sense that it views the action not as complete from beginning to end. We don't see the beginning points and end points, but we do see the action as in progress right in front of us, and so it's proximate in terms of its viewpoint. The imperfect tense form is imperfective aspect again for the very same reason that it views an act as in progress, not from beginning to end, and thus there's some proximity, but there's more remoteness compared to the present tense form, but not as much remoteness as, say, the aorist tense form. The future tense form that we'll look at has perfective aspect. It does view things from more beginning to end, more completely, collectively, as a whole, in its entirety, and it has remoteness, but from the standpoint of time, temporal remoteness. Here are the new forms for the imperfective active indicative that we're covering now in lesson number 12. You probably thought at this point, when were we going to get to these new forms? Well, now we're finally here. With that background on the meaning and the significance of the imperfect tense form, now we actually look at the form itself. And so for first person singular of this verb, for luo is our root word. You have, in the first person singular, I was loosing. The form is eluon. And notice I've put in the translation behind each word, sometimes called a gloss, I've put for each translation or gloss the meaning that would indicate ongoing activity in past time, which will be true in most contexts that you see the imperfect tense form used. So imperfect aspect, or imperfect form, active, indicative of luo, first person singular, eluon. Second person singular would be elues, you were loosing. Third person singular, eluen, he, she, or it was loosing. And then we move over to the plural. First person plural, eluamen, we were loosing. Elueta, you were loosing, you plural. And third person, they were loosing, is eluan. Now something to note that's often confusing for people is the third person plural, eluan, is the same spelling or form as first person singular. How do you know the difference between the two? You'll only know based on context. Having seen now the forms for the imperfect active indicative mood verbs, now let's talk about the elements or the features of the imperfect tense verbs. First of all, it's going to have a present tense stem. In this case, we've been using luo as our root word, and the stem here would be the lambda upsilon, and so everything is built around that stem. There'll be a connecting vowel, whether it's epsilon or omicron, followed by a set of endings called secondary endings. And then at the beginning of the word, there will be what's called an augment. And there's two types of augments. There's first of all the syllabic augment, it's called, which involves the addition of a new syllable. Remember the word luo? There was no epsilon at the beginning. But when you add the epsilon here, an augment, it indicates that now it's different from the present tense. It's now the imperfect tense. So that's what's called the syllabic augment. Another type of augment is what's called the temporal augment. And they call it this because it involves a lengthening of a vowel. When you have a verb that begins with a vowel, like akuo, I hear, or agero, I raise, or anedidzo, which means I renounce, those verbs all begin with a vowel. And that vowel will change in terms of its length. It's going from a short sound to a longer sound. In this case, the alpha to the eta, or the epsilon to the eta, or the omicron to the omega. So you need to recognize that there won't be a new syllable added. It'll just involve at the beginning of the word a lengthening of a pre-existing vowel. In some cases of the imperfect tense verb, you may have a compound form of a verb, like ekbalo, that's put into the imperfect tense form, like here, exabalin. In that case, what happens is there's not a new syllable added per se in front of ekbalo. You wouldn't have ikbalo, for instance. But what happens is after the kappa, there is the insertion of a new syllable, a new epsilon, ex-ebalin. But in this case, because now what comes after the kappa is a vowel rather than another consonant, you see the change there to the kasi, from the kappa to the kasi. And in some cases, there is no such change if you've got a prepositional prefix like appa, apakteno, I kill. And when it's put into the imperfect tense form, it just simply involves a change. There is an insertion of the vowel epsilon, but in this case, the omicron drops out. And so there was a new syllable added, but it's a little harder to detect in the second instance. When we learned about present tense verb forms, we also learned the present indicative form of me, I am, a being verb. And here are the forms just by way of review. But the imperfect indicative also has its own set of forms. Now this won't be true for every tense of verb form that we're going to study. For example, there won't be an aorist indicative form of me. There won't be a perfect tense or pluperfect tense indicative form of me. There'll just be the present tense, imperfect tense, and we'll see a future tense. But the imperfect tense, imperfect indicative form of me occurs here, as you see in the yellow. Amain for I was, ace for you were, ain for he, she, or it was. Amen or ametha occurs in two different forms commonly for first person plural, we were, and then eta for second person plural, you were, and asan for third person plural, they were. Now, having seen the forms of the spelling or conjugation for the imperfect tense, as well as its function and meaning, let's look at some examples from our workbook. And I've selected here some of the even-numbered examples because in your assignments you're going to be working, for this lesson anyway, on the odd-numbered translation exercises out of chapter 12. So here we have number 4, and this sentence uses two imperfect tense form verbs. We have therapeuo as the first one, I heal in the present tense, and sozo, meaning I save. But here in this example it says, in those the days, and literally in Greek, but we would not translate it that way. We would say in those days. Ha kurios is in the nominative case form, so there's your subject, and corresponding with a singular subject, the verb for therapeuo or heal in the imperfect tense form is going to be third person singular. That's how it appears, etherapeuin, and it matches the singular subject. The Lord healed or was healing. Who was he healing? He was healing the crowd or the multitude, and thus you see there the accusative case form. And not only was he healing, but he also was saving or saved. There again, third person singular, imperfect tense, active voice, indicative mood form for sozo. He healed them from the sins of them, or from their sins is how we would say it. But here you have no context provided, so you don't really know if this was something ongoing or if this was something instantaneous. We do surmise that it was probably something ongoing, and thus it would probably be better to translate, in those days the Lord was healing the multitude and saving them, was saving them from their sins, because you've got a group of people, and thus there was probably one succession of healing and saving after another. it probably could be, if this was talking about an individual who was healed or saved, then we could translate it, in those days the Lord healed that person and saved that person from his or her sins, because healing and saving are instantaneous acts. So by explaining all this, we're distinguishing aspect, which is how this is portrayed. It's portrayed somewhat remote, looking back in time, but yet not as proximate as the present tense would be. And yet it's also from the vantage point of something that was in progress. It's not looking at it as a collective whole per se. And in its past time in terms of the temporal reference because of the prepositional phrase in those days. And whether it was continuous action or momentary action, I've already explained that. So you've got to distinguish all three elements, aspect, time, and kind of action, when you look at examples like this. Here's another example from our workbook, number 8, and this is an actual verse out of Scripture, Acts 3, verse 1, and it says, Petros de Kai. Now, when you've got de and Kai next to each other, you're going to have to translate them differently, and thus the New King James does that here with now and. Now, that would be de, Peter and, that's Kai, John, Ioannis, there's one of our vocabulary words for this lesson, went up or were going up. That's anabino, a term we've already learned in a past vocabulary list. They went up, and in this case it's imperfect tense form, it's active voice, and it's third person plural in this case. Anabainon, which by the way, the first person singular form would be the same, but in the context here we know it's third person plural because obviously you've got two people involved, Peter and John. They went up into the temple, to the temple at the hour of prayer. So again, you've got to look at aspect. It's being viewed somewhat remotely. It's in progress. It's not a complete whole. That's the writer Luke's perspective as he's composing this verse. And in terms of time, he's looking back in time. We know that from the narrative context. So it's past time in terms of its time. Kind of action, that's something altogether different. And they went up to the temple and probably viewed as one act at this point, though it took a little time to actually get to the temple. So you've got to look at kind of action, time of action, and aspect. And here's a third example from our workbook. It's number 18. And here too, we also have two verbs that are in the imperfect active voice indicative mood form. And it's to be translated, the apostles prepared or were preparing their hearts and preached or were preaching the gospel to sinners. The two verbs involved would be hetoimazo and keruso. And hetoimazo here, you can see that the epsilon at the beginning of the word has been lengthened. There is that temporal augment that I mentioned. It's been lengthened into an eta rather than an epsilon. And it has the third person plural form ending, the omicron nu ending. And so you would translate that without any other context. I'm assuming here that the writer probably meant that this was ongoing action in past time. So the apostles were preparing their hearts. Perhaps you could say just they prepared their hearts. And then secondly, the same is true with the verb keruso. And in this case, you have an augment that's not temporal augment, it's a syllabic augment. Instead of keruso, you have keruso. The epsilon has been added to show you that this is imperfect tense form. And again, it matches the third person singular form for the imperfect active indicative, for they were preaching, the apostles, plural. Now what we want to do with our remaining time is move on from the made-up examples from our workbook to actual examples from the New Testament. where we see that the imperfect tense form is used in a variety of ways. Let's look first of all at Matthew 26, verse 16, an example from the New Testament where the night before Jesus Christ was crucified, Judas sought to betray him for a period of time. And so in this verse it says, from that time, he, that would be Judas, sought opportunity to betray him. And the verb, therefore, sought is in the imperfect tense form. And we need to ask ourselves to distinguish the three components again of the verbs functioning in this particular verse here: aspect, time of action, and kind of action. First of all, what's the portrayal or viewpoint of the action by Matthew here? He's portraying Judas's verbal act here with the imperfective aspect. We know that it's imperfective aspect because the imperfect tense form is what's used, just like a perfect tense form would convey imperfective aspect. So the aspect would be imperfective, where the action is viewed as something that's in progress, but it's viewed a little more remotely than the present tense would convey, but not quite as remote as, say, the aorist tense form. What about the time of action? Well, the time of action is clearly in the past. Matthew's writing retrospectively. He's describing an event that evening. From that time, he says, the prepositional phrase is used there. So it's past time, but also that helps indicate the kind of action. From that time, a certain activity occurred, namely Judas' seeking to betray Christ. And so we have a marker for the beginning of the action. It was that evening, from that time, and it was continual until the arrest in the garden and the betrayal of Jesus with a kiss by Judas. So that phrase, that prepositional phrase, from that time, is very helpful to note the kind of action and the time of action. The kind of action could have been ongoing and continuous from the time it began. I don't think it's saying here that this was a one-time act that evening. This was something that was progressively ongoing, continuously, for a period of time that evening. And so that's the kind of action. And each time you look at an example like this in Scripture where the imperfect tense is used, ask yourself again the aspect, the viewpoint of the action, the time of the action, and the kind of the action, and distinguish those three. Now here we see another example of the imperfect tense form used of past time and continuous action, as it often does. In fact, most often does, but it's the context that determines this meaning. In Acts 8, verse 3, it speaks of Saul before he was saved, how he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. Now, the entering and the dragging are present tense verbs. We're not going to comment on those at this point, but there are two imperfect tense forms of verbs that are used there, the verbs made havoc and committing. And let's ask ourselves the question again, what is the aspect or portrayal of this action? Well, it's imperfective, simply because it's imperfect tense form. And it's, in terms of the time of action, it's past tense, as the writer Luke is reflecting back on this incident. It's not something that was presently ongoing, it was done in the past, based on context here. And what kind of action was this? Was it one time only? Well, we know that it had to have been continual because it speaks of entering every house and dragging off men and women. So this was something that must have happened more than once, that it was repeated by the Apostle Paul before he was saved, when he was known as Saul. Now here's a new example, Galatians 4, verse 20, where the perfect tense form is used of present time rather than past time. Here Paul says, I would like to be present with you now and to change my tone, for I have doubts about you. That expression, I would like, athelon, or athelon in this case, is the imperfect active indicative form of thelo, for I desire, or I wish, or I will. And the time here is clearly present time. Well, how do we know? It's true that the phrase I have doubts is present tense, middle voice, indicative mood, but tenses don't inherently denote time. That's why we look at the adverb here for now. It's RT in this particular sentence. So you shouldn't translate this verse, I was wishing to be present with you now. That translation would be reflective of the traditional understanding of the imperfect tense that our textbook writer Ray Summers has, that the imperfect tense form always conveys continuous action in past time. Well, that obviously doesn't fit here in Galatians 4 verse 20. It's obviously present tense. Here's another example of how the imperfect tense form can be used for a different period of time. In this case, not merely past time or present time, but unrestricted time. It says in Matthew 23:23, where Jesus is lambasting the scribes and Pharisees in that context, you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. In this verse, the verb is adai or adai, could be pronounced, and it's the imperfect active indicative form of the verb day, which means it is necessary in its present tense form. And so literally, verse 23 could read this way, it is necessary to do these things without neglecting the others. You could translate it as sort of omnitemporal, if you wish. This is a temporally unrestricted statement that refers to an ongoing spiritual obligation, whether past or present, and something that's always binding, not just tithing dill and cumin and mint in the past or the present, but to have justice and mercy and faith in the past and the present, and I suppose you could say even the future, but it's sort of an unrestricted time use of this imperfect tense form. And so the imperfect tense form, I want you to see from these last few examples, can be used in contexts where the action is clearly in the past, or whether it's in the present, or whether it's an unrestricted or timeless type of action or truth that's implied. So the imperfect tense form can clearly be used for all three time tenses, so to speak, past, present, and future, though I would say that there's no explicit uses of it for the future where it's just the future that's in view. There are a couple of instances where it's used in this unrestricted time sense that we saw in the last verse. But with the remainder of our time in this lesson, I want to focus on examples where the imperfect tense form is used for momentary action. Remember that our textbook defined the imperfect tense is that its meaning was always continuous action in past time. Well, that's not true, and I want to give you some examples to show you this from the New Testament. Here's one in Matthew 7, verse 27, where it speaks of the fall of a house. And the imperfect tense form is used here in the context clearly of a momentary or instantaneous action, though this is its more rare use for the imperfect tense to speak of something that's momentary or instantaneous. That's clearly how it's used here, however. Most of the time you're going to see that the imperfect is used in contexts where the action is something continuous. But how do we know here that it's momentary or instantaneous? Well, the imperfect indicative form of eimi is used here for ein, third person singular, but we also see that it's next to the word for fell or fall. Fall is the noun form, fell would be the verb form epicen. And by the very nature of the word fell as a verb comes from, this is the aorist form here for fell, the aorist form of pipto, meaning I fall. But it's clearly a one-time event by the very nature of the meaning of the word fall. To fall is not something in a house. Falling is not something that happens over a long period of time. It took 6 hours, let's say, or 30 years. Great was its fall. No, it's obviously referring to a storm that quickly came upon this house and it quickly fell, and it was a great fall. So obviously this was momentary action in past time. Here in Mark 14, verse 35, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's in agony prior to the cross, agony of soul. And here we have another use of the word for fall, or pipto. In this case, it's imperfect active indicative, third person singular, epipten. And the kind of action here is not an inherently ongoing continuous action, but it's viewed somewhat remotely as an act in progress. And some have actually argued in the past that Jesus did keep walking a little bit and then falling down and walking a few feet further and then falling down. But they based that conclusion strictly on a misunderstanding of the imperfect tense form of the verb here for fall. And I think it's better to just simply understand that Jesus went a little farther and then he fell one time. If this verse meant to say that Jesus kept falling down every few feet, Mark would have used an adverb to modify fell, like to denote that Jesus fell again, or he kept falling, or he fell repeatedly, or something to that effect. So here we have another example of the momentary action type of use of the imperfect tense. Here's another instance of its momentary use in Matthew 24, verse 1, that says, Jesus went out and departed from the temple. The verb departed is imperfect tense from paruomai, and the kind of action here is clearly momentary or instantaneous, not something that's continuous and ongoing. To leave the temple is not a continuous process. It's an action done at a moment in time. Thus, it's momentary. While it is viewed as an action still in progress, it's imperfective in its aspect. It is not necessarily an ongoing continual action or iterative event because of the nature of the verb departed, that inherently involves a spatial boundary that was crossed. If it were a repetitious, continual, ongoing event, Jesus would have had to go back into the temple and exit it time and time and time again, but that's not what verse 1 is saying here in Matthew 24:1. And here's another example from the Gospels, this time Mark 14, verse 70 of momentary action of the imperfect tense form. And here it is Peter's 3 denials. It happens to be his second denial that's described in verse 70. And it says that here he denied imperfect indicative form, third person singular of arneomai. And we know that this action was momentary because this was Peter's second of 3 denials the night that Jesus Christ was arrested and he had his trials. The Gospels do not include 3 separate series of denials by Peter, with each series being continual or repetitive. And so these were individual acts of denial, and therefore Mark 14:70 has to be an example of the imperfect tense form used for momentary action, a moment of denial. Now, so far, almost all the examples I've given you have come from the Gospels or Acts, what are considered narrative portions of the New Testament. But what about how the imperfect tense functions in epistolary literature? Is the imperfect tense used differently in Paul's epistles, let's say, than it was in the Gospels? And the answer to that is no. Here's an example from Romans 7, verses 5 and 6 that fits well with the context of continuous action in past time. It's common or normal type of occurrence with the imperfect tense form, where its aspect is clearly remote in terms of perspective, or more remote, of an action that is viewed as being in progress. We were in the flesh before we were saved. And the passions of the flesh were aroused by the law, which were at work in our members and so forth. We were held by these things in our BC days before we were saved. So clearly in Romans 7, the imperfect tense form is used in its normal way of a continuous action in past time, but It's not always used that way. In fact, right here in Romans chapter 9, verse 3, Paul says, "For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen according to the flesh," namely his fellow Jews. He wanted to see them saved. That phrase, "I could wish," is imperfect tense, middle passive in form, indicative mood of euchomai, meaning I pray or I wish. And so the time here is very important. Paul said, "I could wish," now is the idea. Not I used to wish about something in the past. This is not about ongoing action in past time. This is a present desire of the Apostle Paul. Now you might say, well, in what sense is this remote aspect? Because it is imperfect tense, and therefore it's imperfective aspect, which is somewhat remote. Well, it's not remote in time, temporal remoteness, but there is a certain logical remoteness that's involved here, as Paul wished or desired something only hypothetical, not actually possible. So he's viewing it, his desire or wish, from somewhat of a distance per se, in terms of it being a logical remoteness. That's about the best way I could explain why it has imperfective aspect here in this particular case. Just a couple more examples now from Paul's letters. Here we have in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, another use of the imperfect tense form, but clearly not of ongoing action in past time. Paul writes, "Oh, that you would bear with me in a little folly." And that phrase, "would bear," is imperfect middle indicative, second person plural form of anexomai. But the time here is clearly not ongoing action in past time. This is a wish, again, by the Apostle Paul in present time. And so it's present in terms of the time of the action. And the aspect here is still imperfective. You might say, well, in what sense is it remote? Well, again, it's not temporal remoteness, but probably more of a logical remoteness, like we saw in Romans 9, verse 3. Now, the last example I'd like to use is from Colossians 3, verse 18, where in the context he's talking about the roles of husbands and wives. And here it says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord." And that phrase, "is fitting," is imperfect active indicative form. And so the time of the action here is obviously not to be something in the past, as if we would read verse 18 this way, "as was fitting in the past in the Lord," i.e., but not necessarily now. No, Paul's whole point is that wives should be submitting to their husbands presently. We could even say perpetually throughout the church age. This is something that is to be true or fitting in the Lord. Now you might say, well, in what sense is there remoteness involved here with the imperfective aspect? Well, it could be translated this way, or at least understood this way, "as it should be in the Lord." That's the same idea as is fitting. But "as it should be," again, carries somewhat of that logical remoteness rather than a temporal remoteness, just like we saw in the examples of 2 Corinthians 11:1 and Romans 9, verse 3.